Good evening. Hope everybody's doing well. I'm with you. I know it's gotten a little cooler outside, but I'm roasty toasty in here. I don't know about you. Wish I brought the preacher style handkerchief or something to mop my head, because it's coming. At any rate, we are ready for Genesis 25. This is the midway point, if you will, of the Genesis story, although we certainly have a whole lot more ground to cover since we have 50 chapters. But we have been talking about Abraham for some time. But if you remember, we talked probably several weeks ago now. I think the word that kind of ties all this together, I know Genesis, the beginnings, we understand that as it's the first book of the Bible, and we see how everything unfolds. But I think the common thread as well is covenant. That's kind of the idea of this covenant relationship that God established from the very beginning with mankind. That covenant was broken, and God restores, is starting to make that relationship be able to be restored as he has made this covenant with Abraham, this promise. And we see how everything has unfolded since then, with doubt along the way, but yet with great faith along the way, and we'll see that continues with Isaac and his family going forward as well. And so now in chapter 25, we wrapped up last time talking about Abraham sending his servant to find a wife for Isaac. Sarah had, again, presumably died. I know some people thought that perhaps, or at least there's some theory that Sarah was still living when Abraham took a second wife that we know of Keturah, and also had concubines. But I take it as though she had passed away and he took another wife there in chapter 25 and verse 1. But then going forward, we see that Abraham does die. There in chapter 25, we get a little bit of detail of the family tree going forward in verses 12 through 18. We learn that Ishmael would live 137 years, for example, and then you get into verse 19, and that's when we start getting into the story of Isaac. And when you look at that, I want to just start off by reading verses 19 through 28. So anybody comfortable reading that whole section, verses 19 through 28, and then we'll make some points before we actually get to the questions themselves. Go ahead, Seth.
What was that? I'm sorry.
Genesis 25, 19 through 28. No problem.
Genesis 25, beginning what verse?
19 through 28.
This is the genealogy of Isaac, Abraham's son. Abraham begot Isaac. Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah as wife, the daughter of Bethuel, the Syrian of Padan, Aram, the sister of Laban, the Syrian. Now Isaac pleaded with the Lord for his wife because she was barren. And the Lord granted his plea, and Rebekah his wife conceived. But the children struggled together within her, and she said, "If all is well, why I'm like this?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. And the Lord said to her, "Two nations are in your womb. Two peoples shall be separated from your body. One people shall be stronger than the other, and the older shall serve the younger." So when her days were fulfilled for her to give birth, indeed there were twins in her womb. And the first came out red. He was like a hairy garment all over. So they called his name Esau. Afterward, his brother came out, and his hand took hold of Esau's heel. So his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So the boys grew, and Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. But Jacob was a mild man, dwelling in tents. And Isaac loved Esau because he ate of his game, but Rebekah loved Jacob.
Okay, thank you, sir. So I've got a couple things that jump out to me. Let's see if there's anything that jumped out to you in reading that. Of course, it's probably one of those texts that we have read several times, but this time in particular, there are a couple things that maybe stuck out a little bit more than they have before, or at least I'd forgot from last time. Anything in particular? Mike?
Several things I think interesting is, one is that she had her doubts about what she wanted to have. Why was she pregnant? You know, I think that's common. You know, I'm not so sure she wanted to be pregnant and stuff like that. But it's interesting that the Lord would reveal her thoughts about that to us. He revealed that to us, and I think that's interesting. Also, the fact that when Esau's heel was grabbed by his brother, it seemed to indicate to me that the Lord was purposing to the unborn at that time. Those were people. Those were people that they were complete. They were formed, and he purposed before they were born. What they were going to do. And so today's critics who want to say, you know, this, I think some governor there in North Carolina said that, you know, even after birth, it's all right to kill it. Like you said, fetus, but the child, that there's a life there. It's important to God.
Sure.
And so I just thought that was
Yeah.
interesting. And also the fact that evidently that that you could love one child more than the other. I thought that was kind of, well, I mean, we have children. I don't know if we could say we love one child more than the other, but there may be something more to that I don't understand.
I mean,
But,
mine did, but they never admit it. But yeah, right.
Maybe that's a secret thing between you and God.
No, I understand. No, I get your point. Yeah. No, that always gives you a little bit of pause, doesn't it? Now, a couple things before we get to once she is pregnant. The first thing that jumps out to me is that Isaac prayed to the Lord for his wife because she was barren. That should be a little bit of a flashback back to his mom, right? Because here we have this promise, and yet Sarah's not able to have a child. Now Isaac is this seed of this promise, and he has his wife, and Abraham was very careful about how to make sure this woman was selected, and now she can't have a child. And so Isaac prays to the Lord for his wife because she was barren, and the Lord granted his prayer, and Rebekah, his wife, conceived. Now, when you read that passage right there, just that verse in verse 21, you would think it was instantaneous, right? But it's not, because what do you see here? Isaac was 40 years old when he took Rebekah. But then, fast forward to verse 26. Afterward, his brother came out with his hand holding Esau's heel, so his name was called Jacob. Isaac was 60 years old when she bore them. So they're married for 20 years before they ever have this child. Now, what's a simple lesson to take from that?
Patience.
Patience.
And they did not try to help God.
Right. Maybe Isaac had listened to mom and dad leading up to this and said, well, I've heard this story before, because you have Isaac praying, and for 20 years, it may seem that the answer was no. But we're shown that everything happens in God's time, and that what may seem impossible for man is possible with God. And so this 20 years, and that was an encouragement to me when I was thinking about that today in reading. In the world that we live in, and I think I've referenced this before. I remember Lowell Sully saying back at West End that Christ isn't a microwave fix. And with God, He's not a microwave fix. Could He make things better in an instant? Absolutely He could. But we can't treat Him that way, that as soon as I go to God and I pray to God, it better be the way I want it to be when I wake up the next morning, right? God sometimes says, no, you can wait a little bit, pal. Or it might be, no, you don't need that because I know what you need. And so I'm not going to give that answer. Now, for Isaac, like his father, he needed to keep in the back of his mind, well, God's promised my father to be the father of many nations. And so this has to happen. Now, I'm the son of promise. He made it clear that Ishmael wasn't it. He made it clear it was Abraham and Sarah, and Isaac was born of Sarah. And so it's clear this has to continue through Isaac. And so at some point, Isaac has to try to keep in the back of his mind, and maybe this is why he's able to keep his bearings about him and keep his cool about it. But still yet, it doesn't stop him from going to God in prayer because it's on his mind. He's knowing that this is part of the promise, and let alone the stigma that was attached to even bearing children in that time. That was a big deal. But especially with this promise mixed in, Isaac is trusting God. He goes to God in prayer. God grants his prayer. But again, we've got to connect the dots from 21 to 26 and understanding it was not an instantaneous answer the way we may like for God to work in our own lives. And that's a quick lesson right there. Other comments or thoughts in regards to that?
I just think when you read chapter 25 and you remember Abraham and Sarah and the promised child, and here we go again. It took 20 years. It truly is a promised child, and in both of those cases, I don't know how much insight we can get on God's election, but it's evident that it is God's election. It was with Abraham and Sarah, it is with Isaac and Rebekah. And, the lesson we had not too long ago, that God is God and we're not. He's sovereign.
Right.
He's going to do this on His time and His way. And many times it's contrary to human wisdom. We see, this is not the only time that the youngest has been exalted, where typically it's the firstborn, And why is that? Well, I don't really know, other than the fact that God selected it that way.
And it's about to happen again.
Yeah. And it's going to happen again.
Right.
And it's happened through history. We can think of names, from Joseph, King David, and the tribe of Judah wasn't and it's on and on and on. You can see that the order is changed because God chose that way.
Right.
And we may not understand it. And when you read Genesis 24 and 25 and Romans, the book of Romans in its entirety, tries to get into this, get us to understand more about God's election and so forth and so on. It all kind of fits together. But the bottom line is we have to have faith that, it's kind of contrary to our logic and our wisdom, and maybe that is by His design. Not maybe, it is by His design. That it would not be. It would be something that would be unusual, because it was His election.
Right. Right. And as you're talking about there and using that word election, do you think, and this is just supposition, but do you think that might be where the hurdle is for some of our religious minded friends, especially in the world of Calvinism, that think about election. You've got the pre-selected Abraham, the pre-selected Isaac, the pre-selected Jacob, the pre-selected Joseph, and on and on and on, and David. And like you said, no doubt they were handpicked for the job. And now we're here in the 21st century, and that's the way some, unfortunately, look at religion, in that God is picking and choosing those who will be saved. Well, there's a big difference between these elections. He was selecting them. I mean, he did so with Paul and with the other apostles as well. Jesus did. But they were selected for a specific purpose, for a specific task, in order for God's will to be accomplished. But the election following that, we even, wasn't it this past Sunday, talking about this idea of predestination. When you zoom out, the real selection is, or election is, in the New Testament, God elects those who fall into his, not fall into, but follow his way, who go his direction in how he is prescribed for man to go with obedience. And so there is a difference there, but I don't know exactly what the draw is, unless it's just trying to draw a connection to Old Testament and seeing how God selected certain individuals to serve. But again, God never shut the door on anyone either, and saying, well, you're not allowed to be faithful to me. And you may try to argue, well, God hardened Pharaoh's heart, but it was because he was already predisposed to that. He already was hardening his own heart. For the Jim?
You notice in all of those that were selected, none of them were disobedient. All of them were obedient to his word and his will. There was no disobedience there. And even though he selected them for a purpose, they still were obedient to his word and his will.
Mm-hmm. Notwithstanding some bumps along the way, but yes, I agree. Yeah, absolutely.
You've had bumps.
Yep. No, I'm not putting myself in their category.
But you know, and again, the point is that the selection, whatever we want to phrase that, even all the way back to Abraham, it's not about flesh.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really not about flesh with faith, it's about faith. It always has been.
Right. Right.
You know, from Abraham, it was about his faith.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, circumcision, we know all that. We know all of the Old Testament concerning those things, but it's always been about faith.
Right. You know, the more you dig into the Genesis story, and you're drawing these comparisons like we have in the past with our Hebrew study, so much of it is types and shadows of foreshadowing what is to come in Christ. Not saying that they weren't done for a purpose. I think a big purpose was to lead us to that end, to see, as the point was made over and over in the book of Hebrews, Jesus is better, his ways are better, that there's no need to go back to the old ways, and that there's true fulfillment in Christ that you don't have anywhere else. Mike?
Well, there's, just like with Israel, when they fell from against God, there was always a remnant that was faithful.
Mm-hmm.
Noah, throughout the whole world, Noah was found to be a righteous man.
Right.
Now, he didn't have to pick up the hammer and start building that ark.
Mm-hmm.
But he was of disposition to believe God and obey him.
Right.
We're, in effect, I think I could hardly hear everything Brother said, but we are, in effect, pre-selected. That God has chosen to be obedient and faithful to have a home in heaven. Now, we have a choice during that road, on that path,
Mm-hmm.
to turn our back on God and become disobedient. And
Right.
that still doesn't negate the fact that God pre-selected those who were going to be rewarded with heaven if they obeyed him. It's just that we have failed in our obedience to God, and we were the ones who were faithful.
Yeah. Okay, and so And that was just my first observation about Abraham or Isaac praying in the 20 years. Mike had made a point about Rebecca and the struggling within her, and I don't know if it's based on translations. I didn't look at multiple translations on this, but Seth's was a little bit different than mine when he read. But in verse 22, it says, "The children struggled together within her, and she said, 'If it is thus, why is this happening to me?' So she went to inquire of the Lord." I don't take it as though she didn't want to be pregnant or regretted that she was pregnant necessarily, but to the extent of my take would be that she was in pain. She could feel the striving within her womb, and perhaps to the point of being so miserable that she thought maybe she was going to die from this. If it is thus, if I'm supposed to be pregnant, then why is this going on? Why am I having to endure all of this? And so she went to inquire of the Lord. That's the part that jumped off the page at me this time. She went to inquire of the Lord. Now, for the second time in as many verses, Isaac and Rebekah could be wondering if and how this promise is going to be fulfilled. But yet again, we see that it's met with faith. I would pose to you that verse 21 is the first time that we have recorded for us, and I think it's pretty safe to say it, the first time we have recorded for us the first trial that Isaac and Rebekah go through, at least in Scripture, and they meet it with faith, in approaching God in prayer. Isaac does. Then in 22, she went to inquire of the Lord. It could be in this idea of inquiring of the Lord. I read that it could mean that she went to inquire of a prophet, as we read of Moses saying that the Israelites did with him in Exodus 18:15, as well as what we can read in 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 9, dealing with a seer or a prophet. Or she could have asked Isaac to inquire on her behalf. But it's hard for me to necessarily conclude with either one of those when the text simply says that Rebekah went to inquire of the Lord. There is no mention of confiding in Isaac or going to a prophet or a seer or what have you. It says that she went to inquire of the Lord. So if that is the literal case, and I'm not saying that it's 100% certain that that's what happened, but based on just what we're told, if that is to be taken literally, this would be, by my count, the first recorded instance of a woman praying to God. You might say, well, Eve spoke to God, but that was a person-to-person communication in that way, and I guess God replies back to her in verse 23, but the interaction that Eve had with God was reactionary from the standpoint of she was caught in sin. Adam had passed the buck to her, Eve passed the buck to the serpent, and God deals with all of them. And so that seemed more like almost a face-to-face interaction, if you will, where Rebekah is taking the initiative of herself to go to God to inquire of what is going on, what's happening. There was concern, I believe we could say, for her. And so what was God's answer for Rebekah?
There are going to be two peoples, two nations.
Mhm.
We're going to be there, and the firstborn was going to have to serve the younger. And I'll have to look, can't remember.
No.
They shall be divided. The people will be divided.
Right.
They won't be on friendly terms.
Right. I don't know if this is the first time that she heard that there was twins, but there's no mistaking it now. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you shall be divided. The one shall be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. And so the 2 nations is, you could say, part of the fulfillment, I would say, is part of the fulfillment of what God told Abraham back in chapter 17 in verses 4 through 6 when he said, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations. No longer shall your name be called Abram, but your name shall be Abraham, for I've made you the father of a multitude of nations. I'll make you exceedingly fruitful, and I will make you into nations, and kings shall come from you. And I will establish my covenant between me and you and your offspring after you throughout their generations for an everlasting covenant to be God to you and to your offspring after you. And so we see that there. It's mentioned again in verse 16 that Sarah would be blessed, that she shall become nations, kings of peoples shall come from her. And so really this is the culmination of that fulfillment. I mean, we know there's a nation formed with Ishmael, and we have the Ishmaelites, but furthermore, directly from the promised child Isaac, from his seed, there's two nations coming from there. Of course, one being Israel and the other one being the Edomites. And so there is, while on the front end that seems promising because that's a fulfillment of God's prophecy, on the other hand, that's also bad news, isn't it? Because we see that they are going to be essentially at war with one another, or they're going to have strife with each other. There's a negative aspect to this. We of course know that Jacob and Esau would have conflict of their own. We'll see that here pretty quick, even within this text. Well, not so much conflict, but conflict will result from this next section. But it's in the time of David that we see that the Edomites are pressed into servitude in 2 Samuel chapter 8 and verse 14. We see there in 2 Samuel 8 and verse 14, then he put garrisons in Edom. Throughout all Edom he put garrisons, and all the Edomites became David's servants, and the Lord gave victory to David wherever he went. And so even just in that verse, you see the promised nation is succeeding, the Edomites are failing by comparison. Anything else in regards to that first question?
We have to realize, and you said this, but we need to say it over. We have to realize that things happen within God's plan. The Edomites didn't serve, Esau didn't serve Jacob immediately, but that resulted in the future.
Right.
And even though these twins were tumbling within her womb and making things hard for her, we know that kind of thing has happened before, because when Mary walked into the presence of Elizabeth, her baby jumped within her womb.
Right.
Obviously jumped within her womb. And so that can happen. It's not the baby in the womb is not something that just lays there and doesn't do anything and doesn't move until it's born. That's not true. And these twins were already at odds with one another. They were already struggling against one another. And Jacob already grabbed Esau's heel, as Mike said. And that we need to realize that God's plan is God's plan, and we have to work it as He causes us to.
Right. Right. Okay. And so with that, and we get to the birth itself and going forward, describe the children of Rebekah. He just notes verses 27 and 28, but I think we could note 24 through 26 as well. The details of their appearance at birth, including Jacob holding on to the heel of Esau, which is what led to his given names: supplanter, deceitful one, who takes the heel, or he cheats. And my brother is named Jacob, which led me to, I don't know why I didn't ask Dad before, but I asked him, were his intentions for naming my brother when I'm the firstborn, that he was going to take my part of the inheritance? And he said, I think he said, you're catching on, or something like that. And so maybe not the best name choice, but anyway, he goes by Jake anyway. So, but Esau, of course, also this tie to the word red is going to be even focused on even more when they're dealing with the birthright. But as far as the description of them as adults, we see that Esau is the rugged hunter, outdoorsman type. Jacob is the more inside kid, right? He's You can imagine just the paler one of the two, you might think. But he's called a quiet man dwelling in tents. But we also see that there were favorites between the parents here, don't we? Isaac loved Esau and his food. Rebekah loved Jacob. Now, how do you explain that one loved one and one loved the other? Does that mean that Isaac hated Jacob and Rebekah hated Esau?
No,
Okay.
no. There are things that you can do with one that you can't do with the other. I taught Gretchen how to drive.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter, I taught her how to drive. I couldn't teach my son how to drive. He wouldn't listen to me.
Yeah. Yeah. So are you saying you loved her more because of that?
Well, I'm saying that there are things you can do with one that you can't do with the other.
Right.
And Isaac could do with Esau. He could eat his meat
Yeah.
that he brought in from the field, and it tastes different. Wild meat tastes different than tame meat,
Uh-huh.
and he loved that, and that's he couldn't do that with Jacob.
Okay. Okay. Charles?
Sometimes there's more similarity between a child and a parent more so than taking sides. Not to say that one loves the other, but the similarities of their likes and dislikes causes one to have more in common with them and to do more with them and to grow not distant from the other, but in closeness that they can't have with the other because the activities are different.
Right. Right. Yeah, this is, maybe this will be helpful as well. I don't disagree with either one of those either. But Gresham from this version of Truth for Today said, each parent loved, which is the Hebrew word aheb, a different son, but the Hebrew word is a common term expressing affection between family members. It does not imply that either parent had animosity toward the son that was not favored, but that they showed preference or partiality toward one or the other. And then he says, note chapter 29, verses 30 through 33, which is where we see the comparison between Jacob's love for Rachel versus his love for Leah. I think verse 30 kind of helps unlock the difference there. So Jacob went in to Rachel also, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and served Laban for another 7 years. When the Lord saw that Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren, and Leah conceived and bore a son, and she called his name Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has looked upon my affliction, for now my husband will love me. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, because the Lord has heard that I am hated, he has given me this son also, and she called his name Simeon. Now she says that she's hated. I believe it's by comparison and contrast, or by contrast of what is said in verse 30. He loved Rachel more. I wouldn't make the argument that they loved each child the same. I would take it that Isaac preferred Esau over Jacob, and Rachel or Rebekah preferred Jacob over Esau. But I wouldn't go as far to say that they had disdain for the other one by comparison either. I don't think that's what's to be implied at all. Yes, sir.
But Rachel had the revelation from God that Esau would be the weak, that he was his brother.
Right.
I don't know if she revealed that.
That's a good point.
She had kept that, I don't know.
Yeah.
But she may have, because we see later on the kind of deceitfulness that was practiced in the still. The people, they had faults.
Yeah.
But what she practiced and put into play was based on, I believe, the fact that God told her this is going to happen. So, it's just unclear that God's will did prevail on that.
Right. There's no doubt God's will is going to prevail no matter what. I would pose that even if Jacob didn't cheat Esau out of his birthright, that God was going to see it happen one way or the other. But that's the point you make there about Rebekah has this revelation from God that one is going to be stronger than the other. The older shall serve the younger. And so with that knowledge in her own mind, how is it how hard would it be not to look at your younger son a different way? Well, he's the one that's promised to be the stronger, or to be the one that is going to be served, that he's going to be greater. It would be difficult, and maybe she didn't reveal that to Isaac. Maybe she did, and Isaac just was trying to stick to tradition of the firstborn son, even though he was secondborn, I guess, to Abraham, but firstborn of Sarah. But nonetheless, we see that I think it's just by comparison that it was clear that one was favored over the other, just as Joseph was clearly favored over his brothers as well. I think that's another one that we see there. Okay, anything else in regards to that? Okay, so what is a birthright, and how did Esau despise his birthright? Sold it, okay? And so let's set the table here, pun intended, right? And Esau does what he does in working in the field while Jacob does his inside job. But an interesting note, again, that I found in this commentary is that he referred to the pot of lentils as, according to the New King James Version, red stuff. I never caught that before. I've been mired in the ESV, but when I read that in the New King James, I was thinking, man, is he using the Message or the New Living Translation or something to use his commentary? I might have to put this one on the shelf again. But red stuff is what is used, what's translated in the New King James Version. Now you can, I like that translation just from the standpoint of you can see the hairy, sun-baked guy coming in, famished, like, give me some of that red stuff, right? I don't care what it is, just give it to me. He didn't look long enough to even know what it was, probably. But he referred, quote, he referred to the pot of lentils as red stuff. Here, Moses parenthetically inserted another play on Esau's name, connecting it with Edom, which is derived from the Hebrew word red, Adam. And so the red man is going to go for the red stuff flippantly, as what we see with the birthright. But as far as what the birthright is, what is a birthright? I think we pretty well have a good understanding.
It's a special privilege of the older child.
Right.
They get a double portion.
Yes and no. Double portion after the law of Moses.
Right.
And so Deuteronomy 21:17, that's where we see the double portion prior to the law of Moses, based on what I read with the ancient Near East. They said that birthrights, there was never a set specific inheritance as far as percentages or anything like that was to go to the firstborn. But yes, the double portion comes in Deuteronomy 21:17. And so we see that this is a form of inheritance. There was an expectation for Esau. Jacob knew that. And so how did Esau despise his birthright? I think the best definition of despise in this case would be that he thought lightly of or had a lack of care for his birthright, which this is just another example of how we look at life in the long term and the short term, isn't it? Esau saw the immediate need that he had. I'm hungry. I need to get my belly full. I want to eat. What do I care about this birthright? He had no vision of the long-term future. He treated it flippantly. He had disdain in that way. And so it's that idea of I get what I want now, what I think I need now, and yet being flippant towards the future. And so in that way, he despised, he thought lightly of, or didn't really care about his birthright. As you see there, Jacob said, sell me your birthright now. Esau said, I am about to die. Of what use is a birthright to me? And so we'll get into question 4 and then the next section